This is episode 8 of Youthful Perspectives. I'm your host, Mason Bierbaum. My guest today is Briana Bierschbach, a political reporter for the Minnesota Star Tribune who has worked for a number of other news agencies like Minnesota Daily, Associated Press, and NPR. Her expertise spans multiple fields, but is primarily focused on state government and politics within Minnesota. Our conversation covers a multitude of topics about Briana's career and journalism as a whole, from her reporting process and interviewing philosophy to her experience of being a woman in a male-dominated industry and the intense pressure journalists feel. Whether it's through personal experiences or observations, Briana provides a unique insight into the vitally important field of journalism, and I am grateful to have sat down and talked with her. And now, here's Briana Bierschbach. Well, thank you, Briana, for joining me today. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. We'll start off with just a brief overview of your background.
Yeah, so I grew up in Minnesota. Actually, I grew up in Avon, which is a small town in central Minnesota, probably near where you grew up as well.
That's exactly where I grew up, too.
Yeah, and it was lovely. It was a great place to, sort of be outside in nature and play and everything. But, I loved to read and write growing up. And, when you're thinking about a career, there's not a ton of options in terms of what to do with an interest in reading and writing. And so when I was in high school, a teacher actually told me I should consider journalism. And so that's how it piqued my interest in the industry. And then I looked into programs and I found the University of Minnesota had a good journalism program. So I came here, did that, worked at the Minnesota Daily, which is the campus newspaper, and was lucky enough to graduate a semester early, actually, from the U because I had some credits from high school. And that set me up really well to actually take what used to be this part-time, full-time job working for the Associated Press at the Capitol. So that's how I actually started in political reporting. So I did that for 4 months, which is how long the job lasted. And I've just I liked it so much that I've just stayed in politics working for different news organizations. So from there, I went to a now defunct, sadly, political organization called Politics in Minnesota, which was very insidery, but I learned a ton about state politics there. And then I went to a nonprofit newsroom called MinPost, and then Minnesota Public Radio, which was very fun. And I would have stayed there for a little bit longer, but my dream job, which was working at the Star Tribune, a position came open in their Capital Bureau. And so that's where I've been now going on 5 years.
That's great. Now am I correct? It's the Minnesota Star Tribune now? They did
it's
some
funny
new
that
branding.
you remember that, and I'm not saying the new branding correctly, but yes, it's now the Minnesota Star Tribune, which is part of this idea that we want to make sure people know we cover the whole state. And that I think in previous iterations of the paper, it was the Minneapolis Star Tribune, but we're really expanding our coverage out and covering all of the state.
That's great. So it seems like in high school is when that interest in journalism kind of came about, or a teacher kind of presented that idea to you.
Yes.
But you already had that interest, whether you knew it or not.
Yeah, I think a lot of people get into journalism one of two ways. They find out they're really interested in reporting, and the idea of, talking to people, or they're really interested in writing and reading. I was the latter. I was really interested. I read constantly growing up. I wrote in journals. I loved English class. I loved AP English, and a teacher, Mr. Krogman, who I think is probably retired now.
I think so. The name does sound familiar.
Yeah, he was great. He was my AP English teacher, and he said, if you really want to do this, you could, but you should consider journalism, and you should start by writing a story for the paper in high school, which I didn't work for at the time. I didn't take that class, but so I wrote a freelance article for them, and that was kind of the start of it for me. And I came to the U knowing that, hopefully I would get into the journalism school, and I did, luckily. It was competitive, actually, back then. It might still be. And then I got really what was sort of pivotal to my growth was working at the campus paper, the Minnesota Daily. It was, where I learned that I liked to write, but I also liked reporting, because I think you can like to write, but you might not like talking to people, or you might not be curious, or you might not like the process of doing journalism. So that was really the place where I learned that I did. And I got to cover city government. I got to cover the Al Franken recount of 2008, which was really cool. And I covered Minneapolis city elections. So that was my first step into politics on a local level. And then from there, I actually met a mentor who was a teacher at the journalism school who has now left, Chris Eisen. He was really interested in some of the stories we were doing at the Daily, and he thought of me when the job came open at the Associated Press to go to the Capitol. So it's always good to remember that people kind of nudging you toward things along the way. Listen to them, they might know something that you don't.
Absolutely. It seems like there's like certain moments in your life when you're progressing through a career where it's like this person did that, and it's not, you don't connect the dots initially when it's happening, but then when you look back, it's like, oh, this happened, which caused that to happen, which caused this to happen, which leads me to where I am now. So
exactly.
That's very cool. I'm just curious on when you were growing up and you were reading, what exactly were you reading that you were so interested in?
Everything. I mean, I read books, I think the first, I read Little Women, which is about, it's an extremely thick book when I was in fourth grade. I was a voracious reader. I would pick up everything from the library that I could. My dad always had the newspaper around. We didn't talk about politics. I didn't really think about politics as much as something that I could cover one day. But, he was always interested in the news and would, kind of bring things up. But, I had the newspaper, and the St. Cloud Times at the time was kind of always around. So I, whatever I could really get my hands on, whatever books where my mom had around, I would grab off the shelf. So it was just kind of convenience of reading. When I went to school and I figured out how to use my library card, I expanded my horizons quite a bit.
Absolutely. I think I can relate to you as well, whereas my dad had his own personal library at home, and it seems the older I got, the less and less amount of books were on his library, and I was slowly growing my own library in my room, so exactly. I can relate to that.
Yeah.
So that's a good little brief background that we provide then for the listener. Now I kind of want to switch over to your career aspect of it, which you've touched on a little bit. But can you describe your process when reporting on an issue or creating a story? Yeah,
I mean, it can really look a lot of different ways depending on what the story is. Because I cover state politics, it's usually one of a few things. During the first half of the year, which is coming up here, in January, I cover the legislative session. So I'm at the Capitol, and all the lawmakers come back, and they, for 4 or 5 months, make policy. So during that part of the year, I'm really I think a lot of stories start with a question I might have. What are they going to do about the budget? With divided government, or how will a contentious issue like abortion play into politics, or who is going to be the number one decider or player behind the scenes? So I think a lot of times that's how story ideas formulate. Sometimes I have a question. I assume my readers might have a question too, and so I just go about answering it. Other times it's something's happening that day that we have to cover. I don't necessarily like to call the Star Tribune the paper of record. Other people do, but it does put some pressure on us to, when there's a big event happening, cover it. The governor has a press conference announcing a new initiative. We'll be there. I might write a short story on it. So sometimes the process is just decided by the fact that something is happening that day. Otherwise, it's a question that I might have. Sometimes it's, during the course of a legislative session or election, there's a theme that I keep seeing come up again and again. Some kind of issue that keeps getting trickled into conversations either with voters or politicians. And I stop and think, I keep hearing about this a lot. This might be something bigger. There might be something bigger here that I could formulate a story around.
So is this a philosophy that you developed at the MN Daily at the university, or is this something that you kind of grew into as your career progressed?
I would say I started with the basics at the Daily. I've grown a lot over the course of my time being a reporter. When you're young and green, you're just kind of figuring out the who, what, where, when, why.
Absolutely.
So that was a lot of what I think I did at the Daily. But I did get to start to do some of that work at the paper too. By the end of my time on the campus paper, I joined what was a sort of mini projects desk. We would do data requests. Maybe we wanted to know who were the highest paid teachers at the University of Minnesota or administrators, or where was there like a bunch of bulk in spending that, because there was always questions about why they were raising tuition, and was the university spending its money wisely? So we'd have a question like that, and we'd do data requests. Or because I covered Minneapolis City Hall, I noticed there were tons of perennial candidates, so candidates who run over and over and over again and never win. And I just had this question: why do they do this? So I wrote a profile of a bunch of perennial candidates. And one thing that I did at the Daily that was really hard at the time because I'd never done anything like it. But I started to dabble a bit in investigative journalism. There was, at the time, during the Minneapolis City Council elections, there was a longtime councilman who represented part of the university area, and he was being challenged by a student named Charles Carlson, who was young, LGBTQ, and he really seemed like he could mount a spirited challenge to this incumbent. Another student profiled him, and we started to hear some buzz that maybe he was lying about some details of his life. And it turns out he was actually lying about quite his whole background, really, and we had to dig in, and it was quite a lot of work to prove it. But he said he was British. He was not. He said he went to Princeton. He did not. He said he had, played tennis with Hillary Clinton. I mean, his story was kind of fantastical, and maybe it should have raised red flags when we were first writing profiles on him, but it took a lot of digging to figure that out. He ended up dropping out of the race. So I learned a lot doing that. I would say I would do things a lot differently now if I were going back in time and trying to investigate a story like that, but you have to start somewhere, and then you develop those tools as you go.
Yeah, I see a lot of correlations between this philosophy of yours and like the Watergate scandal and how you follow the money. You know, you can see a lot of information just by following the money, and that question of why tuition is being raised is still a question that's asked today at the university. I think it always will be asked whenever price of college keeps going up. But then also that investigative journalism aspect too. I mean, what a great on-the-job experience to get to hone that skill in too. And I would assume it had to be a little daunting of a task, something you've never done before, and it's pretty high profile, at least for like city politics in that sense. So
I remember it got picked up by the Star Tribune, where I now work, and some other, there are some stories that other outlets can't ignore, and that was one of them. And I had to. I remember how I had a breakthrough in that story. Was I picked up the phone book and I started calling people with the last name Carlson to see if I could find family members who could clarify some of the questions in his background. And if you can imagine, we live in Minnesota. There are a lot of people with the last name Carlson. So it took a long time. And then one night, I think I was there late. I lived down the street from the paper, so I was able to be there way too late. I get his parents on the phone, and they kind of immediately said, "Oh no, what's happened now?" And you could tell it was really sensitive, and there was a lot there, including some history with mental health issues that were ultimately unpacked in the story, and led it to be a little bit more sensitive than it might have been if I didn't know any of that information. But yeah, it was pretty daunting and intimidating, and a very good experience for me too.
Absolutely. And so when it comes to interviewing people, do you have a certain process that you go about when it comes to talking to individuals? Because for the most part, I would assume when you're doing other just regular journalism or investigative journalism, these are people you've never talked to before or maybe in a professional capacity, and I feel like it's hard to get people to kind of loosen, around you and like bring their guard down. So do you have a certain process when it comes to interviewing people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think people don't want to trust reporters necessarily. Some people, politicians that I talk to, some of them like talking to the media, right? It's not, that's not hard to get them to open up because they're interested. They want to get attention to their talking points or get their party's view in the paper. But when, you're going to someone who's never talked to a reporter before, they're nervous about how their views are going to be represented. You kind of have to step back and say, you don't have to talk to me. It's only if you're comfortable. And what you realize is that people actually really want to be listened to ultimately, and your best tool is just to really get out of the way, I think. I think journalists sometimes have a tendency to, want to jump in while someone's answering a question. Sometimes silence is your best friend. Just sit and let someone talk and let them finish a thought, and they'll go places that might surprise you, and you'll realize that they're more comfortable than they initially thought they were. And more open and, more trusting of you if you just let them speak, let them kind of finish their thoughts and see where it takes them. And, you'll be surprised at, I've had conversations go completely in different directions than I think they're going to because I just sort of got out of the way myself. But it's hard. It definitely doesn't always work. There are people who they're hostile from the second I try to talk to them, and they continue to be hostile, or they'll give me a little comment and make a little, another comment after that, like, I don't want to talk to you, you're the liberal media, or you're just going to misconstrue what I say. And, that happens. And you can just say, that's okay that you feel that way. It's no problem if you don't want to talk to me. But if you change your mind, this is how you can reach me. So that's a strategy I take.
It's got to focus on what you can control as the journalist.
Absolutely.
That's a good rule for life, it seems like, too. I know when I doing these podcast interviews, I always try to let the guests speak. I don't want to be interrupting left and right with questions. If I have questions, just keep them up in the noggin until they're done speaking, sort of deal. But I think I also witnessed this more on like television news, where the host or the journalist, whoever it may be, seems to want to get in there and say something. I don't know if it's just the structure of the way that it's formatted and all of that, where they have to get in. They have to say so much in like 8 minutes. It's like, how do you solve the border crisis or whatever in 8 minutes? Like, well, you're not going to be able to do that in 8 minutes probably. So
yeah, medium is really important. That's a great point. I mean, what I do is, is written down. I get to take what I hear from someone, and I get to digest it, and I get to listen back to the tape and pull their best quotes. On CNN, they're sitting there trying to grill, a politician. And there are times when I will be in a position to grill them to, say, a press conference with the governor. He'll take what are called off-topic questions after the topic of the press conference is over. The reporters will sometimes get to ask questions about other things that are going on in the world, Why did you say this? Did you misspeak here? Or, just potentially, do you want to ask them about events in the world that they might have response to? I think it'll be interesting now that Governor Walz is coming back to Minnesota and isn't going to be vice president. It'll be really interesting to see how he handles being governor now with a Trump administration in Washington. And is that combative? Is the federal government going to be butting heads with the state? And I think that'll often be something, we're kind of trying to grill him on. So it can be like that, but you just don't see that in my process because I do print medium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think in regards to that question with Governor Walz and the relationship with the federal government and state government, I watched his press conference he gave at, I think, Egan High School, just shortly after they lost the election. And he's like, Trump says that they want to bring, the states, all this power back to the states. And he's like, well, I welcome that as the governor. So it seems like he's taking on the challenge more than shying away, which I would expect most people in his position to do. So, like you said, it'll be interesting to see how that goes about in the future here. Yeah. When it comes to investigating a story or creating a story, what do you find are your biggest challenges?
That's a good question. I think sometimes it's just getting basic information. I mean, that sounds silly, but there are a lot of hurdles in journalism, in life, to finding out answers to questions, right? Say I have a question, which is, how much is the state spending on this? How many of our tax dollars are going toward this program or something like that? Government might not want to give you the information to answer that question, right? You might have to put in a data practices request. So that's where you say, when information is public under law, you say to a state agency, I'm requesting this officially. You might, have to go and request emails from public officials to try to answer those questions. Those data requests can take months, sometimes years to get back. So, there's just a lot of resistance sometimes when you're doing, I think, more important stories, more challenging stories to get the information you need to answer questions. Sometimes the challenge is the trust issue that we talked about, is getting people to open up to you. Getting people to, people who don't want to talk to you to become sources, to become people who trust you and give you information that you need to either further a story or publish a story or, to give you information that could lead to stories down the road. Those are big challenges, sometimes the challenge is just time. I think I'm also someone who has to write about breaking news. Sometimes the challenge is just, this just happened. I have 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I got to send my editor a draft of this story. And then I got to develop it and update it throughout the day. That can be a big challenge too, is just the pressures of the time crunch. We live in a social media environment too. So, so many things are breaking constantly on X or, TikTok. I don't know how much people use TikTok as much, but, the current and the incoming president certainly uses social media did a lot in his first term, and I expect will in his next term. pretty regularly break news on social media platforms, which might make certainly people in Washington have to deal with this constant time crunch, and a news cycle that's just developing rapidly all the time.
Yeah, that was one thing I was going to ask you, is like how you deal with breaking news stories, because I've always been fascinated by that as someone who's been consuming journalism or just news since I think it was probably COVID is when I really got tuned into it. So it was 2020. I think I was a freshman in high school, and it was just like going from that time period. You get a breaking news story. Like I remember the first Trump assassination attempt, and it's like shots fired at a Trump rally, and it's like, oh, like that's interesting, and then more to come, and then all of a sudden you just keep waiting, more and more and more information keeps coming. Or you take X, for example, when you have the trending space on there. I remember watching the presidential debate versus Trump versus Harris, and you just keep refreshing that trending, and it would switch depending on what they said, as the conversation went on. So it's just almost instantaneous. So I was just curious more on what the process is like covering a breaking news story. If you could highlight an example, perhaps, too.
Yeah. No, COVID is a really good one. I was just actually starting at the Star Tribune when the pandemic hit, and a lot of that information was coming through government, right? So being a State House reporter, I was often on the front lines of information coming into the state and to our readers about, how many deaths the state had. The governor would often have press conferences with his health commissioner, Jan Malcolm, at the time. And so she would daily at 2:00, they would tell us how our lives were going to change. At 2:00, he might close schools. At 2:00, he might close bars and restaurants. He might order a mask mandate. I mean, people were so hungry for this information. It's interesting that you mentioned that COVID is when you really got engaged with the news, because a lot of people did then. Our traffic spiked. People needed information, and they needed it immediately.
Yeah, it was out of necessity, really.
Absolutely. It was their whole lives could change in a moment's notice, and they might need to make a grocery run because there might be limited hours potentially, or maybe liquor stores will have to close, and so they need to run and get some booze and stock up for however long, they don't know. So we became not only like a central hub for information for people, but also the pressures to get it fast, to get it first, was really intense. So, I remember we would always, whenever the governor would hold a press conference or before his 2 p.m. briefing, there would be pressure on all the journalists in town to figure out what he was going to say before he was going to say it. So if someone else got it first, we would have to go to our sources who we knew were in some of the rooms where these conversations were happening. We'd say, can you confirm this even on background? So we'd have to get 3 or 4 people potentially to say, yes, he's going to lift the mask mandate at 2, or yes, he's gonna open schools again, or So it was intense, and we would sometimes break it ourselves. Sometimes we were following other people, but everybody in town was working their sources because there was so much interest, and it was so important. It was so important, and it was the pandemic is such an interesting moment in time too, because people's lives were changing quickly. And they needed news organizations, and there was just a lot of confusion. I remember I wrote this kind of running Q&A, or like an FAQ, which was basically like what you needed to know about the current restrictions in Minnesota. And I updated it all the time. And my phone just like blew up off the hook. People would read that and call and say, okay, here's a scenario for you. This was during a lot of the lockdowns. They were like, I remember this so well. A woman called and she said, I drive every night with my husband, who has limited mobility, to this lake, and we watch the sunset together. And she said, can I still do that with the current restrictions on COVID? And it kind of made you want to cry, It was this sweet moment and this sweet thing that she does every night for her husband. And they sit and watch the sunset on the water, and she didn't know if she could do it. She just wanted someone to explain to her, and she had read my article. And people needed that information. They needed it quickly, and it it changed potentially everything about the way they lived their lives. She could do that, by the way. There was nothing wrong with that. But it was, it was just a crazy time.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I mean, sometimes when I reflect back on that, and I'm like, I can't believe we lived through a pandemic like that. But then in the grand scheme of history, I mean, that's very common in the human population, just human story, to live through that. But I remember sitting in Mr. Amdahl's class, you probably remember him, learning about the Spanish flu. And we're sitting there looking at photos from 1919. They're wearing masks in school, and we're sitting there social distancing, masks in school, and it's like, history doesn't repeat itself, but certainly rhymes. So
sure. Yes.
That was a very fascinating time to grow up in. But you talk about sources too when it comes to like the governor making those announcements, but that's a very important part of journalism too. I'm curious what steps you take to ensure a source is credible, because I'm sure you take great care to make sure that the information you put out there is trustworthy and true.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. It's certain people in politics reporting in particular, which is what I can talk about. You encounter certain characters all the time, right? So I know I'm going to be talking to and asking questions of the governor a lot, and we get to know sort of what he's credible in that he is the governor and that what he says is important for the citizens of the state of Minnesota, but he can misspeak, he can say things that might not be intentionally misleading but might accidentally be misleading, or there might be certain things they don't want to reveal to us. Same with Republicans in the legislature, leaders in the legislature, and Democratic leaders in the legislature. So you kind of get to know the different characters in that building and which ones tend to tell you the truth, which ones might say something off the cuff and might not know all the details and might get something wrong, and you have to double check it. I mean, we always double check as much as we can when it's a sort of factual piece of information they're giving us. Mm-hmm. A lot of it is them talking about their opinions about things, which are their opinions, and we use those as we do. But in terms of people who are not the governor, not legislative leaders, not politicians in general, you have to take a lot of care because they might give you a piece of explosive information, and you can't just run with it, right? You have to sit and fact check it. And depending on what that piece of information is, it might be really involved and really intense. It might require some of those things like data practices requests or working sources on background or, and then eventually posing a question to someone powerful once you have, enough information. But you really do have to do your due diligence. You have to make sure what they're saying is true. And some people, especially if someone wants to be anonymous, I think that's something that we encounter a lot is people who say, I have a piece of information, I want to give it to you to look into, but I don't want to be attached to it in any way because they could have repercussions in their lives, right? They could lose their job or they could get in trouble. So in those situations especially, you really need to verify information because when someone is not attaching their name to it, they could have motivations that you don't know because they're not being open and transparent necessarily in who they are. They don't want that piece of information out there. So, you do what you can to check it, court records, data practices requests, interviewing different people, all the tools in the toolkit. Yeah,
that's interesting to know, and it's important to know too, but I think that's one of the dangers when it comes to social media is you can get an explosive piece of information, and especially in this current environment that we're in where, the common saying, if it bleeds, it reads sort of deal. So if you get something that's like super far out there, super toxic or divisive, people are going to, oh my gosh, they said this just happened. I'm going to click on it right away. And as a reputable reporter for a reputable news, company, the Star Tribune, it's important to maintain that reputation and that you don't just fall into that trap, because I would assume it's very it's easy to, especially for young reporters too that are probably trying to make a name for themselves. Again, I just keep thinking back to the Watergate example. I love the movie All President's Men, where when they're investigating and they're doing the deep background, or they call him Deep Throat at the time, the anonymous source, and it's like he's saying some pretty crazy things, but they have to keep it anonymous, and then they're getting talked down by the press secretary for the White House, and they're young and they're not that established. So it's, and eventually they're rewarded for their hard work. But the due diligence part too, just to do your research and all that, very important. And it can be hard to wait. Sometimes you're sitting here thinking, I have this huge explosive story. There's pressures, right? Is someone else going to get it? Is this person talking to anyone else? Are there pressures? Is this going to end up on social media one day and then I'm going to have missed my shot? Sometimes when things like you mentioned break on social media, we don't always run with them right away. Even though people might have seen it on X, they might have said, okay, well, I saw this on social media. Why aren't you reporting this yet? We might be sitting still in the middle of verifying whether or not something is true. So,
it's really important to make sure that everything's verified, even in cases where you think no one else knows about it, just you, or in cases where everyone knows about it in the world because it's been on social media, but you're not sure yet if it's true. Yeah. So it's really important.
And then when it comes to getting information from different sources or multiple sources, how do you deal with information that might be conflicting with one another, where you have a source tell you one thing and another source tells you another? What's your process from, filtering out what's true and what's not in that situation?
Sometimes you have to go back to each person and say, well, they're telling me this, but you're saying this. Mm-hmm. So why is there a discrepancy there? So sometimes it's trying to get people to explain the issue or why there is two pieces of conflicting information, especially in politics. Sometimes it's just conflicting worldviews, which you can do nothing really about. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, you really just have to show both. If you aren't able in the time that you're given to verify which one of these is correct, or you're sitting here in a situation where people look at a set of facts, which happens a lot now, one set of facts and see two totally different realities. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you're in a position where you have to sort of present both realities. In other times, I think that's irresponsible, right? You don't want to contribute to misinformation, right? So I think in those situations we would certainly not do that. But it's really difficult. It's one of the hardest parts of our job, especially in political reporting, is that we're increasingly living in a world where people just see things so differently, the same thing potentially, or you're getting two pieces of conflicting information about the same issue. And you have to make sense of it for readers, because at the end of the day, they're the people that you're serving. Is the citizens of the state of Minnesota, the people who read the Star Tribune. They are the ones. You don't care about this person saying this or this person saying this piece of conflicting information. You need to get it right for the reader. And it can be sort of the most challenging thing, increasingly the most challenging thing about our job.
That seems like that's like your North Star, I might say, when it comes to reporting and just conducting journalism. Mm-hmm. Is just you're doing it for the best interests of the reader. Yeah. And not putting your own career in front of the reader. You got to kind of swallow your pride sort of deal and just, prioritize the reader first and foremost, mm-hmm. which is important. And I think, again, you see, like, whether it be CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, now this is just my personal opinion, but it seems like a lot of those, again, there's a lot of profit motive behind just outraging people, so they tune in, and then you get all the ad revenue. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't seem like they, at least in my opinion, that those news industries don't have for the best interests of their viewer.
And certainly we feel pressure of the bottom line too. It's just different, right? They're trying to get eyeballs on the screen. We're trying to get people to subscribe to our paper. Mm-hmm. And what tends to make them subscribe is trust and quality information, right? If you lose the trust of someone, it's really hard to get it back. Yeah. And one mistake, one kind of big correction, right? Which we run when we mess up a story really badly. We tried to get we had two pieces of conflicting information. We tried to get it right, mm-hmm. and maybe we didn't that time. That can really mess with your trust. That can make people unsubscribe from your paper. And I think, I think about the reader first when I'm even formulating story ideas. When we were talking before about, if I have this question, I bet my readers do too. Mm-hmm. But I also have to check myself, because politics in the capital world is insular, and it can get kind of too inside baseball. And we can sit there and write about these kind of silly little battles that go on. And I often am saying, does this actually matter to anyone outside of this building, to our broader readership? Would they care about this little fight that's going on? Mm-hmm. So I think it's a good thing to always check in the back of your head, have the reader in mind, and say, would they care about this? And is this important? If this is important to them, why? If this little insider fight has a bigger implication for their lives, make sure we're explaining that and leading with that in the story.
Yeah. So keep asking questions, both literally, but then also to yourself personally, mm-hmm. In the sense, why would they want to know about this? Yeah. What's important about this, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really great to keep in mind. Mm-hmm. Do you remember publishing your first major story? Was it at MN Daily, or was it maybe later on? And if so, could you describe what that experience was like?
Yeah. I don't know if I remember my very first. Gosh, that's a great question. I should go back and look at my clips at the Daily and see what. I'm sure my very first story was not a big deal. I do remember publishing that investigation I had mentioned earlier about mm-hmm. the student. I mean, that was super intense, because I knew that this was going to sent his life in a different direction, right? It's the first time I wrote about something where I knew that I specifically was going to change something dramatically for someone else, a specific person, a person in the world, and journalists can be sued for libel. The bar is pretty high when you're running for office or if you're in public office. But I was just very nervous. I had the proof. I had him admitting that he lied, and I was running the story, and I knew it was going to cause ripples, both in the race he was running, but just in sort of general city hall chatter on campus. So it was very nerve-wracking. I think I always feel a little sick before I want to run before I'm about to run a big investigative story, and that is normal. It just means it's important. But as long as you've done your due diligence and you feel like you've fact-checked it and done everything you can to make sure the information you're presenting to the world is correct, it doesn't make it any easier to sort of disrupt and change someone's life dramatically, but it can make it less nerve-wracking when you have to do it. But that was a really big one. When I was working in politics later, I was very nervous in the beginning. It was definitely a boys' club at the Capitol. There was hardly any female journalists, no less females in general, women in general at the Capitol. I mean, the building used to not have bathrooms for women. So and I was 22. I was right out of college. It was very nerve-wracking. So pretty much any time I published a story, I was pretty nervous. But, definitely in those early days, any kind of investigation I did really kind of, they're very memorable. I remember kind of where I was right before I would, my editor would say, I'm hitting the publish button, and I remember how I felt. And then you kind of just sit there and you watch the reactions to it. It was like that when I wrote about in 2017 about the Me Too movement at the Capitol as well. I knew that was going to possibly take over the conversation in the building for a little while, which it did. And it was terrifying. It felt important. It felt I knew I had done my due diligence, as we talked about, but it was still very scary to know that I was going to change someone's life, and I was going to change sort of the whole conversation at the Capitol.
Yeah, there's so much to just unpack right there. Beginning first with just the disrupting someone's life by publishing this story. I mean, that's got to be so difficult, like you said, to know that what you publish is going to, whether for good or for ill, and in this case for ill, is going to affect them, and to just stop and think in a professional setting and not it's kind of cruel almost, it seems like, and not saying you're acting in a cruel manner, but just like the way you have to conduct yourself as a journalist is you can't sacrifice someone else's well-being for the knowledge of the reader, sort of deal. And if it's true, it's true. Truth's a powerful ally in that situation too. But then also the way I interpret it as well is you're saying you feel sick when you publish a big story like that. Well, it shows you care about your craft, and it's like, if someone just willy-nilly throws out some information that's like super like, oh my gosh, like someone reads that and they don't care, I mean, or they don't feel anything really. I mean, what does that say about them too? So yeah, that's fascinating to think about. And you never know how
information will be taken once it's in the world, right? It's out of your control at that point. You can do everything you can in your power to fact check it, to craft the narrative in a way that's easy to understand, but you don't know how it's going to be digested. You don't know how certain people are going to react, how it's going to become part of the discourse. And of course, every time you're nervous, did I mess something up? What did I miss? You think you've checked all your boxes, but you never really know at the end of the day if there's something that there's one thing you just should have done that you didn't do. Hindsight is 20/20. So it is a sign that you care about, and that I care about what I do, and that I'm always nervous. Did I do it? Do I enough? With the time constraints of journalism that we've talked about.
Yeah, that's great. So you kind of touched on this too a little bit on the men's club and being a journalist at the Capitol, but I'm just curious, being a female journalist, what has your experience been like in a historically male-dominated industry? And you touched on a little more, but do you just remember like that first day showing up to work, and it's like, it must not have felt very welcoming, I would assume.
No, it didn't. And I was 22 when I started at the Capitol for the Associated Press. So I was right out of college. I did go to the Capitol once when I was at the Daily to cover a Tim Pawlenty press conference. I had been thrust into it because someone else couldn't go. I remember I was wearing my backpack. I took the bus and I just walked into this reception room, which is very ornate. It's on the first floor of the Capitol. It's beautiful. It's the governor's reception room, and it's where he does press conferences. And I just walked in, and it was so intimidating. There was just cameras flanking the governor's podium where he was standing, reporters sitting there, and they were all yelling over each other to get into questions. And I was just sitting here with my backpack on. That was intimidating. But even when I entered it in a professional manner, in my first job, it was still intimidating because I had an eyebrow ring. I just couldn't get it out. I looked young, and I was a woman. And I know that I was perceived as inexperienced because I was, but I was also, I think there was an added layer to it because I was a young woman in this place where there weren't that many young women. So I really had to sort of prove myself that I was serious. A lot of that in the beginning was listening and learning. I think if you come in, swinging, sometimes people like that even less. I didn't pretend like I knew everything about what I was doing. I watched my colleagues who had been at the Capitol much longer than me, how they handled press conferences. I learned a ton. They were very supportive too. There were not a lot of women at that time, but there were some women, and the men were great too. The male journalists at all the different outlets, many of whom I've worked with as colleagues now. They were very nurturing. They were very collaborative. I think that's something people maybe don't know about the Minnesota Capitol Press Corps in particular, is it's a very collegial group. We all work for competing news outlets, but we all know each other sometimes better than the people in our own newsrooms because we're in this basement together where all of our offices are, in this kind of surreal world where we are covering the legislative session for 4 or 5 months of the year, and especially at the end when we're there in all hours of the morning and they're cramming the budget through the process. So, it was good. I definitely had to work my way up, earn the trust of politicians. I had to show that I was listening and I was learning. And I think that can cover you in a lot of situations where you might not be taken seriously, is you just have to do the work and want to be there and show that you're going to stay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that can apply to so many other fields too, not just journalism, just in life. Yeah, you might not know everything, but if you make a concerted effort to try to learn each and every day that you're there, people are going to pick up on that eventually. It's, it'll start being reflected in your work as time goes on too. But that's nice that they were also very welcoming as well. I remember being fortunate to have an internship last spring at the Capitol, working for a state senator. They had a lot of speaker series when it came to many of the interns, and we had one with the press corps there, and they're sitting there joking. They're kind of, giving crap to one another here and there in a joking manner. And it seemed like it was a very healthy working relationship, even though they're, like you said, competing news agencies that when that breaking news story comes, they want to be that first one that gets it out there because the first one to get out, most likely to get the most clicks, most views, more money comes in for those agencies. But they were still very respectful and to one another. And it seems like a fun environment to work in too.
It is, yeah. I mean, every day I walk through the Capitol, I kind of pinch myself. It's this gorgeous building, and there's people doing important work there. I mean, whether people disagree with what one side is doing or another, it affects our lives more than even what the federal government does. I think every single year I'm there, I write about some major policy change, tax breaks, or different infrastructure packages and projects that are going to be going up and being built around the state, or policies around marijuana and abortion. I mean, the 2023 legislative session, there was almost so many things that I had been kind of following for years but didn't get done in divided government that all happened at once, and that felt like, whether I had actually written about them all passing, over the years, I'd been sitting there kind of waiting and covering this for a moment where suddenly I knew a lot about all these issues because I'd been there for so long, and now they were all passing all at once. So it's a wild place, and it's a privilege that for sure to be able to not just be there every day, but to be the person who gives people information about what they're doing, and being a watchdog, making sure they don't try to pull one over on the public or try to spend money improperly or pass a policy that has problems. So it's great.
That's fundamental just to the founding of our nation too, and our government, to just have that freedom of the press to hold those politicians' feet to the fire when it needs to happen. But you mentioned that 2023 legislative session, and maybe for some people who are listening to this, they might not know, but that was quite consequential in the terms of how productive it was, whether which side of the aisle you fall on. I mean, you can't deny that it was, a lot was passed.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe you could just go in on that a little bit and just talk about some of the major highlights from that session.
Yeah, that was, after the 22 election, Democrats kind of surprised everyone and had this very narrow control of the legislature. They had divided government before that, and it was by a single vote in the Senate and just a few votes in the House that they controlled everything. And in the past, when that's happened, I would think Democrats have been more careful or cautious, or maybe that's not the right word, but at least they had more trepidation about passing a lot of things, right? They might say, well, we don't have a mandate, or, what were the voters trying to ask for? But Democrats, after the 2022 election, did feel they had a mandate on issues like abortion. And they also said, we've watched Republicans had a few good years, especially in other state legislatures. They had taken control in a lot of other states, and they had passed a raft of different policies that Republicans had wanted to pass for many years. And Democrats in Minnesota really looked at it and said, we have power right now. We don't know how long we're going to have this power. And you don't get power to just sort of hold on to it and hope you can do just enough to get power again, We're going to pass the things we want to pass, knowing that this could be temporary. And so that was their philosophy going into it. And they really did that, right? Within the first month, they had codified what was essentially our standard practices, but codified abortion access into, or abortion rights rather, into state law. They had made Minnesota a refuge for transgender Minnesotans and also people who would come into Minnesota from other states. They legalized recreational marijuana. They passed driver's licenses for immigrants. They, I've written about this so many times, and the list is just massive, right? It was dozens and dozens. They actually had a list, I think, of 30 different policies that they wrote down, like, here's what we want to try to pass. And they had checked almost every single one of them off their list by the time session had ended. And they had an ally in Governor Walz in signing those. Certainly there were disagreements behind the scenes. It was not smooth sailing all the time. There's a spectrum in both parties, right? There's Democrats on one side of the party and Democrats more on the moderate wing and the progressive wing. And same with Republicans. There are more conservative and more moderate Republicans. So they had their own internal battles. But I think everyone was surprised at how much they were willing to get done, given those internal battles, given that they had narrow majorities. And given just sort of the environment and politics. So it was pretty wild to cover. I would say readers were incredibly interested in that. We got tons of traffic to those stories. People wanted to know, and they were just struggling to keep track of how much was getting done. We built a legislative tracker that took some of the biggest policies that people were interested in, and we said, okay, now it's past the House. Okay, now it's past the Senate. And then when the governor signed it, we had a tracker that followed the whole process, and it got tens and tens of thousands of page views because people were like, oh, this is easy to follow. And that goes back to what we talked about in terms of thinking about the reader first. What is it that they're interested in? What is actually, we could write a million stories about every step of the process, but really they want one tool where they can say, check in on what is going on with recreational marijuana, or what is going on with the tax bill or something like that. So it ended up being a really useful tool. Not that we didn't write a million stories about those things too, but it was really something to watch, and I think because of that session, Minnesota was really in the national spotlight during this presidential campaign too, not just because of Tim Walz, but because of sort of what that meant for potentially national politics. He had worked with the legislature to do all these things. What did that mean for the ticket with Kamala Harris? What could that mean for their potential administration? So really it was just discussed so much since it happened.
Yeah, it truly was historic what was passed in 2023. Again, you can't, I feel like that's almost an objective statement right there. Just the sheer volume in and of itself. Yeah. It's funny, it's like people talk about how ineffective government is right now, like the legislative branch, but it's crazy how effective it can be too when it's united like that.
Yeah.
It's hard to keep up with.
Oh, totally. And I think we're about to see the opposite, right? So now the Minnesota House is looking like it's going to be tied 67 to 67, which is completely wild. It's happened. The last time it happened was decades ago.
Was it 79, I want to say, maybe? Maybe it was.
Yes, it was. It was 1979. So, and that was a totally different time in the world, right? We can't even really compare 1979 to 2025, right? In terms of the personalities, the way politics have gone. There's so much more diversity at the Capitol. It used to be pretty much all men at that time. There's maybe one woman in the room during those conversations. So we really haven't seen this happen in modern politics as we know it. So we don't really know what it's going to look like. We're starting to see little hints. We're going to have equally divided membership on committees, co-chairs, but who's going to be the Speaker of the House? Who's going to be the majority leader? It's all up in the air. And Democrats and Republicans didn't exactly end things very well at the end of the last session. There was the 2023 session, which a ton of stuff got done. And then 2024 was just a little more acrimonious. They did a lot more policy work. Republicans just disagreed even more. And they saw what happened in 2023, and they wanted to try to stop more of it. It was just much more controversial in terms of the personalities in the room and whether they were getting along. And really, it blew up at the end of session in a big kind of in a big screaming match on both this House and Senate floor. So it'll be really, really interesting to see both how Democrats in the legislature work together with Republicans now, and how the governor, being he ran for vice president or ran with a presidential ticket, how he works with them in the next session.
I remember interviewing Jeff Howe, the state senator from Central Minnesota, who represents Avon, Albany, where we're from. And I remember talking to him, and it's like, what's that like, being in that minority? And you basically have no control whatsoever on what's getting passed. And it could be very contradictory to many values or ideals that you hold. And he just was just talking about how he really wished that they just have more of like a seat at the table or could just be listened to. And then he's like, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, you just wait if you're a DFL senator, state senator, or House member, and perhaps that trifecta gets reversed on itself. Do you expect them to give you a seat at the table when that was not given to them in 2023? And again, I don't know how accurate that was. That was more his opinion in some sense, but I'm sure there's some truth to it too. He would have a better idea of it than I would. So,
certainly Republicans felt that way. They felt that they were cut out of a lot of conversations, and that often happens in the minority. It happened, when Democrats were in the minority too. They complained about the same things. So I think both sides tend to forget about what it feels like to be in the minority a little bit. Some people do take care to tend to the needs and listen to the minority, because here's the thing. Both sides have good ideas, right? Both sides do actually genuinely want to improve upon bills. And if you really sit and spend a lot of time at the Capitol and sit in committee hearings, yes, there are partisan blow-ups and things that just feel like a localized version of national politics. But there are a lot of things that are done that really just make the bill better, because legislators come from all sorts of backgrounds. Some of them are farmers, some of them are teachers, some of them are lawyers, police officers. They know things. They have expertise in some of the policy they're crafting. And a lot of what they do is little tweaks around the edges that actually improve the legislation. So, it behooves both sides to remember how important that is, and to consider that the other side has something to offer.
Yeah, and I think, again, just being how localized the state politics are compared to national level, you can have people that are, they work on the weekdays, they're out in the Capitol, and maybe on the weekends, they're out back home on their farm. And then when there's a farm proposal by some, that goes across the agricultural committee, and they're like, well, this wouldn't be a good idea because this is like something that happens when I'm farming. It's at like first-hand account of something that you might not get at the national level, and that can apply to so many other things. Because a lot of these senators, state senators, which I just have more of an experience having interned with that part of the state legislature, is just they have jobs outside of being a state legislator or a state senator, whether it's a professor, farmer, you name it, something else, a banker.
Yeah.
So they kind of can bring that real world experience to the legislature, where it's at the federal level still happens, but not nearly to the extent. It more seems like a full-time job.
Yes.
At the federal level.
I think people don't know that Minnesota legislators are technically part-time. They get paid about $45,000, goes up a little all the time. But they get paid about $45,000 a year, and they spend, half their time there. And they spend half of the year doing something totally different. So, and there's a lot of arguments about whether they should be full-time or not. People disagree heartily about that. And I understand why, the idea of the real-life experience is appealing. But it's also really hard to do both things. It's really hard for people to do one job for half the year and another job for the other half of the year. So it attracts certain types of professions more than others. It's really hard to get young people into the Capitol, young parents. They just can't imagine trying to juggle this really intense job and another job and raising a family. So there's arguments on both sides of being a full or part-time legislature. But for now, this is what we have.
Yeah. Got to work within the system that we are provided with.
Yep.
You mentioned Tim Walz being the governor and him being nominated as the VP candidate for Democratic ticket. And I was just interested on what it was like for you as someone who's covered him for so many years when he was first, if I'm not mistaken, elected in 2018, I think. But he also was a congressional representative for the 1st District in southern Minnesota. So what was that like for you as someone who's been following him for so many years to get elevated to this national spotlight?
It was wild, honestly. I mean, I've been covering him. I did not cover him in Congress as much. Because I cover state politics, the legislature, the governor's office. He came into my orbit, and I his when he became the governor of the state. So I learned a lot about him then, and I've learned a lot about him over the years. I mean, it's been 5 now, going on 6 years as governor, or going on 7 years as governor. But we watched him as a candidate in two runs for the governor's office. You learn a lot about them. You follow them around, you interview people who know them, and then to see them skyrocket into this national sort of lens was really interesting, because it's interesting to see what parts of his life were really elevated. We know him as the governor. I hadn't thought that much about him as a coach, because it didn't really matter for him being a governor, but it really mattered in terms of the image of him that was needed to complement Harris on the presidential ticket, right? So this idea of him as sort of a former small-town football coach and teacher really became this big part of his identity to a national audience that was certainly part of his identity when he ran for governor for the first time. But he had been such a prominent public figure now for 6 years that he was known as the governor of Minnesota. He was the COVID governor. He was the governor during the riots. There was so much else about him that had kind of become more prominent in people's minds in the state and in our minds as reporters covering him. But to see a national audience gobble up his bio in such a different way was very fascinating. It was also very intense. I remember the day he was named to the ticket, I had to delete. I was getting so many requests to do podcasts, national television. Things I've never even heard of, because all of a sudden people really wanted local news reporters' expertise on this person. They realized we knew so much more about him than they did. So that was very intense. And then also just the idea that we had this body of work covering Tim Walz, and suddenly a new audience wanted information about who he was. We saw our traffic spike on current and old stories about Tim Walz. All of our coverage was suddenly under this new scrutiny, and kind of was garnering this national audience. So I remember we had probably like 500,000 page views to our website, and to different stories on our website from current or from that day and from past stories the day he was named. And it was just that whole week. It was an intense amount of traffic and attention. And then we also lost access, which was a bummer. I think if you talk to any local reporter, they'd still complain about this. Suddenly this person that we saw every few days, at a press conference, out at a farm or wherever he was doing something, suddenly we weren't seeing him at all. And he was not able to, because of a very controlled national press operation, which is true on both sides. we were not even getting chances to do interviews with him. And so I think that was frustrating too. Suddenly the governor of our state, who is still the governor of our state, is inaccessible to us as journalists. And that was something that a lot of people were frustrated about. But it was something, you know. I went on maternity leave actually in mid-September. So I covered it, you know, for a few months, the sort of zany wild ride. And then I had to stop. And that was hard too, because I was, you know, there were still so many storylines that were going on beyond when my time was covering it. But, you know, I get to come back and continue to cover sort of this next phase for him, which is where he figures out what he's going to do now, right? He kind of put his hat, you know, he went out and on a limb and did this, kind of took this risk. And, you know, what does that mean for for his future career? Does he try to do something national again in the future when his term as governor is up in 2026? Does he run for governor again? Does he run for U.S. senator? Or does he want to go to Congress? You know, he kind of already did that. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens now for Walz.
Yeah, and I just remember when that news first broke and everyone's like, and the long shot candidate from the governor of Minnesota, and like no one's heard of this guy, and we're sitting here like, oh, of course we know Tim. Like,
yeah.
He's like you said, the COVID governor, and he's giving these press conferences. And at the age of 16, I'm sitting there listening to NPR outside with my buddy because we're trying to see if we can have a sleepover tonight or not. Because it's like, are we allowed to go inside with people or not? And now he's just getting this almost international spotlight, you could argue too, just with how much the whole world tunes into these presidential elections. So very interesting to see which comes off as such a regular guy. I mean, I was just in D.C. this last weekend, and out of sheer coincidence, flying back, he was one row behind me and the people I was with, and we got to talk to him for like 20 minutes, and it's just like, he's just a regular dude. He is sitting there reading his Kindle. He has his Diet Mountain Dew that he's always talking about, and he's just sitting and coach with the rest of us, like, you know, quote unquote common folks, and it's just like, that's just so fascinating that someone who is just like at such national levels of fame, and now he's just sitting here with Coach just talking to us like just a regular guy.
I think that was something that national, I mean, what you get with him is what you get is what you see, right? He's not pretending to be someone he's not. That is all very genuine, and that was part of his appeal to the national ticket, right? Was that he was folksy, he was a real person, you know, he could pop into kind of any situation and just chat up whoever, and that is really what he's like. That was kind of critical to his ability to win the governor's race in 2018 in the first place. So that's kind of coming full circle, you know. He still probably will maintain that kind of everyman appeal, I think, now even that he's back in Minnesota.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that national exposure is going to influence his policy making or whatever it happens to be, the way he just conducts himself as a governor, because I'm assuming he learned a lot probably from Kamala Harris, and he's probably had some time to talk to Joe Biden as well and other people too. So it'll be interesting to see if he changes at all in his leadership style. I know I'll certainly be watching for that, and I'm sure you will be too.
Definitely.
So now I just more want to turn back to more your time as like a female journalist in the state legislature. And you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but what was it like being a female journalist when the Me Too movement came about?
Yeah, I would say it was pretty intense. You know, we saw the story was kind of ballooning around the country, right? Obviously starting with Harvey Weinstein, but then it was, you know, other powerful figures in media, and then eventually politics and state legislatures were also getting new scrutiny, right? As people both realized and decided to speak up about what had been a pervasive issue in almost every walk of life, right? Sexual harassment. There was generations of women kind of before 2017 who experienced this, who dealt with it. And the newer generation of women, certainly influenced by the Trump election and the Women's March, had decided they'd had enough and wanted to talk about it, right? And wanted to expose people for some of these wrongdoings that had been happening. So it was an intense moment. We were all kind of waiting, wondering, when will it hit the Minnesota Capitol, right? As a young woman who had been working there for many years by that point, I knew this happened, right? I knew because I had experienced it myself. I knew it because I had heard women who were lobbyists or other legislators complaining about it. And they at those times didn't really want to come forward and make it a story, and you can't do anything about that as a reporter. You don't force issues. You don't force people to talk about something as sensitive as sexual harassment, right? Really, these stories have to be something that someone really wants to tell, and that's ultimately what happened. Is a candidate who, she's actually now a state senator, but she was a candidate at the time, and two current legislators had come to me and said, there's a member of our own party who is well known among women in the Capitol and women in politics as being inappropriate with a lot of people, and we want to hold our own party accountable, and we want to speak up about this person. And at the time, he was a sitting state senator, and I sat down with them and I heard their story, and I had to do kind of all the things that we talked about. I had to vet it really critically, because I think both that I knew that women experienced this. I was not surprised by their story, but I also needed to, because I know how these stories can be doubted and scrutinized and picked apart, that I had to, if I was going to run this, make sure not only that I do due diligence, but that I show the reader all the due diligence that I did. Sometimes journalists tend to think that stuff is wonky and that listeners or readers don't really want to know how you did your homework, basically. But I think in these cases, it was actually really important. So I checked their story. I asked for receipts, text messages. I asked for eyewitnesses, people they might have reported incidents to at the time. And once I had all that information, verified things with multiple people outside of them, I took this to the person in question, the senator who was being accused, and said, look, this is what they're saying. I remember sitting down in his office and having an in-person conversation, and I was uncomfortable, and he kind of denied it at first, and then said, well, I think it was misinterpreted, and ultimately some leadership in his party didn't condone. They said his behavior was unacceptable.
Mm-hmm. Condemned.
Yeah. They said his behavior was unacceptable, and that they were going to look into it. He ultimately resigned, but he faced a lot of pressure to do so, and it kind of exploded from that point. And I thought it might, because I knew there were other stories out there, and there were other people who had similar allegations against them. And so it really kind of took over the Capitol for a few months, I would say. Ultimately, two legislators, someone in the House and in the Senate as well, resigned as a result of that. And then eventually in Washington as well, Al Franken became the subject of allegations of inappropriate touching, things that made women uncomfortable, and facing pressure, also resigned his seat. So it was a surreal time. And as a woman, I think I was well positioned to sort of understand the issue, but I understood the importance of really checking the claims and showing the homework for the readers, because some were meeting these kinds of allegations and these claims with a lot of skepticism. So it's important to make sure, if you're going to publish something, that it's A, verifiable, B, verifiable, accurate, and also just you put all your homework out there in front of people so that they know that you're being as transparent as possible.
It seems like that movement really kind of like brought to the forefront many things that you valued in yourself as being a female journalist, and the fact that doing your homework and making sure it's accurate and correct, and that being a female journalist too. This is a rare time in history where like the women have the upper hand to a lot of this male-dominated industry, just like the state legislatures are predominantly male, and so that power dynamic too, and just like now that they're getting scrutinized for this, but then it can get thrown right back at you, and if you don't do it properly, you can get scrutinized just as much, and you might even jeopardize someone's claim by if you don't do it properly. They're like, oh, well, there's a faulty. The story's not adding up compared to what this journalist is saying. And then the added pressure to that, too. I mean, I couldn't imagine being in your position in that situation. All the other journalists, too, that were trying to, do their job as best they could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you have to – it's a lot of responsibility, right? Because that kind of – remember when I was talking about that sick feeling? Mm-hmm. That the second you hit publish, you have a responsibility to your readers to get it right. and you have a responsibility to also to your sources to get it right, because they're trusting you with this information. They're trusting you, and you've checked it out, and you have to present the information in a way that is true to what they told you. And I think that sounds obvious, but the way in which we have to verify things, the various ways in which we can tell a story can really change the way it's digested by an audience. So it's a lot of responsibility, and it makes you nervous. It makes you, it's the kind of stuff that gets your heart palpitating, but it's important. And it's really why you do this kind of thing. I certainly love stories that are not as stressful too, and I love doing them, and I love informing audiences in all sorts of ways. But at the end of the day, accountability and sort of watchdog and changing cultures, especially at a place so entrenched like the Capitol, is really important, and it's what you hope to do in your career.
Yeah, and just that this whole story just reminds me of the saying, like, pressure makes diamonds, in the sense that you get all this pressure from, whether it's the legislature or the reader that's focused on the journalist reporting this. Well, that added stress is just going to bring your abilities to the best that they can be in that situation. You're really going to push your own limits when it comes to your ability as a journalist, and it seems that's kind of what happened too.
Yeah, you certainly hope so, right? You hope that you shine in a moment when you are going to get a lot of scrutiny and are handling very important, sensitive information. So in that case, nobody... I did do my due diligence, and turned out, more allegations surfaced after my story was published, which often happened too, right? That by a few people coming forward, others now feel comfortable. And so that's ultimately what happened, and the pressure kind of built as more and more allegations surfaced for him to step down. And similar with the House member, because in a lot of cases, the people who were being accused of these things had done them to a number of people, right? They happened to be kind of like Harvey Weinstein, the sort of baddest of the actors, right? The ones who had the most egregious histories, and everybody it was kind of an open secret in their industries that they were like this. But there were a lot of other, grayer areas and in situations that maybe never were reported on or came to light because it was tougher, right? The incidents were not as black and white, and maybe there wasn't ability to verify certain details of it. And that's hard too. That's hard when you open up something for people to talk about, right? Let's talk about this issue of Me Too at the Capitol. I was being flooded with other cases of harassment, both in the legislature and state government, and I couldn't report on every single one of those. And so that's another part of it that is unseen, which is, the weight of people's stories and people coming to you, trying to confide in you and hoping that something can come of it. And it didn't always, right? I didn't write every story that I heard because I couldn't always verify it and do the work that needed and find the information that I needed to find in order to publish it.
Yeah, that's got to be tough too, especially. And that just comes back to that part as being a journalist. You got to put aside your own personal, wishes in a sense, or maybe, I don't know if bias is the correct term, but just like what you hope to happen or what you hope to do. But then you got to be realistic, and you focus on only a select few things that you can accomplish. But as doing research for this interview on the Me Too movement, it seems like that's kind of a common theme at the state level, but there's the movement in general is just took a very few courageous women to stand up and speak what happened to them, and then the floodgates opened. And then once they had those few trailblazers that kind of started the conversation, that snowball effect that kind of just kept growing and growing and growing. So that was I remember growing up, I think I was in 7th grade when this was going on, and I just remember just observing that too, and it was a unique time to just as a 13-year-old guy growing up, and it's just well, that's so interesting. Just think about you got to start thinking about that sort of thing, and it's just it seems like a lot of good has come out of it too, just for a lot of people. Yeah, and
I mean I've talked to people. It's been a few years now since those stories first broke, and I covered this for years. I mean, beyond that, I've covered sort of these types of issues in the world of state government and in other ways for years that followed. But really, the intensity of the moment was right then, and the pressure to both change rules in the legislature to, in theory, make it better, or create clearer lines of reporting, these kinds of incidents, clearer lines of accountability, kind of a chain of command to who is accountable, right, when something like this happens. Those things, and the problem didn't go away, but I've heard from people that the culture has changed, right? Because, as you mentioned, a few women were willing to put their name on a story, right? And I think, as we talked about before, if they would not have used their name, it would have been harder for me to publish that story. I could have I had named sources and I had anonymous sources in that case. And it felt like, after talking with our editor, enough, right? Because we had strong named sources, really credible named sources who were members of the legislature, right? And their accusations checked out, and checking with people who were there and who they reported to. But, so I do think that it has changed things at the Capitol, but it's an imperfect system and it still happens. And, I hope people will still come forward and talk about these things if the system still isn't working the way it should.
Yeah, always room for improvement, no matter what it is.
Definitely.
So now I just want to shift more towards some more just shifting away from the Me Too movement into more just like opinion questions, I guess, that I think listeners would be interested to hear your perspective on. First one being, why do you think the public's trust in traditional media is decreasing? I saw a Gallup poll that said 33% of Americans have a great deal / fair amount of trust in mass media, compared to 36% who have none at all.
Yeah, that's really the question, isn't it? And it's really important for our industry to figure it out. I mean, the obvious answer, and maybe not the fairest, but I do think it's part of it is the political environment. Since 2016, Trump really, tapped into something. I don't think he created the idea of the fake news, but he tapped into and certainly exacerbated this idea that the news media was not to be trusted, that the information they were putting out was false, right? And that didn't come out of nowhere. He understood that there was a base of people in America who felt that way, who didn't trust, the 24-hour news networks and talking heads and even their local newspapers. I sometimes try to say that we're different from this, right? We're like separate, but they feel the same way about us too. Or a lot of people do. Not everyone, but certainly people who don't trust the media tend to extend that even to their local news outlets, which is too bad. I think part of it could be a little bit what we talked about before, the 24-hour news network, the talking heads, the need to crank out news quicker and run with things. And, I think there's feeling that there's a liberal bias in the media and that a lot of journalists are Democrats. I certainly haven't surveyed any of my colleagues on this. So I don't actually know if there's truth to that. I certainly know that of people who probably have liberal views and conservative views in our own newsroom. But in theory, people are allowed to have viewpoints, but what they have to do when they get the job of a journalist is to sort of set those aside and let their curiosity drive them, right? I mean, if you're curious and you ask questions of people on different sides of an issue, you'll find really surprising things. And I hope that, that's how everybody approaches their job. But I know it doesn't matter in terms of people's perceptions. So I also think part of it is people are consuming the traditional media less, right? As cell phones and social media and all these different ways to consume information have proliferated. People go to their news media less, and so it's easier for them to say they don't trust it because they're not really using it.
Yeah.
So that's a big fear for me, is that people don't even really know what we have to offer. I don't know how many times I've had someone email me saying, "Why aren't you covering this? Like this is because you're the conservative or liberal media or whatever." And if they had spent 2 seconds Googling it, they would have found an article under my name where I did cover X, Y, or Z thing. So people are, they just feel this way sometimes without any information to back it up. And I think that must be because people are consuming media less and they hear this narrative that the news media is not to be trusted. I also think we have to do some soul searching as news organizations about how we build trust with people of all walks of life. I think it's problematic to say that the answer to that is this sort of idea of both sidesing media where, you have to quote one side saying one thing and one side saying, you have to quote every single viewpoint, even if potentially some of those viewpoints are inaccurate or misleading. I think we have a service and a dedication to our readers and a responsibility to our readers to give them correct information. And sometimes, one side might not be giving you correct information, or there might be a lot of potential misinformation coming out of a certain movement, a political movement. I can say that, and I'm not trying to both sides, that I can say that that happens on the left and the right, usually within the extremes of the two parties. Misinformation tends to kind of really flourish in the extremes of politics. So that's dangerous too. But, I think it's up to us to figure out why people aren't trusting us anymore. And, continue to just like double down on the fundamentals of thinking about what does the reader need? What does the reader need? What do they want? How do I deliver that kind of accountability journalism that's fundamental to.
And I can't think of a better industry to do a more in-depth and good job asking questions to kind of reverse that trend. Obviously, there's other institutions that have seen a decrease in trust, whether it's the Supreme Court, Congress, just government in general. Yeah. It's traditionally been going down a downward trend. But like you said, I think the news agency will do some soul searching. Yeah. And we'll see what happens that comes out of that. But you did kind of do a nice segue for my next question here in terms of how people aren't necessarily consuming traditional media as much. And do you think that's why podcasts were being utilized so much in this election cycle? It seems Donald Trump did a pretty effective job in tapping into that podcast world where I remember the Joe Rogan example. That's the number one rated podcast in the world. And I think that episode got over 40 million views, I want to say, certainly over 30 million. Wow. And that was 2 weeks before the election. So do you think that lack of trust explains that rise in podcasts?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I think about podcasting a lot because I wonder why, I listen to podcasts to consume news. I think one thing that's great about podcasts is they meet people where they're at, right? A lot of people are busy and they're doing they're running to soccer practice, or they have extracurriculars after work, or they're just trying to get through their day, and when they're making dinner, or when they're in their car, or when they get to the gym, they're turning on podcasts because I think one of the things that we have messed up about the decrease in news subscriptions, one of the things we misunderstood is that the people didn't want the news anymore, and that we had to deliver it to them in these kind of cute or short or different ways that would make them want it. Like we need to figure out how to make them want this thing that we're creating, that we're reporting on the news. But really, people want the news. Just evidenced by the popularity of things like the Daily Podcast and for the New York Times and the headlines and a number of news podcasts and podcasting in general. People want it, but they want it kind of conveniently delivered to them so that they can consume it while they're maybe making dinner or while they're doing some other thing in their life. And so I think that's something that I've taken away from podcasting, is that people actually really want to sound smart and understand the news. They just don't always have time to get to it. So maybe we don't have to, assume they don't want it or their attention span isn't there for it. We need to try to meet people where they're at. I think more news organizations should look into podcasting and trying to like the New York Times does, also give people a way to interact with their journalists in that medium, right? I mean, it's brilliant what they do, where they bring in journalists and just mine their expertise on issues and do it in a neat half-hour episode that someone can listen to at any point. And then they feel like they're smart about some major issue that's happening in the world. So I think that's part of it. It meets people where they're at. I do also think, politicians pretty wisely use that and utilize that. Kamala Harris was also going to sort of key in Walz. Tim Walz were going to keep podcasters on the left who are influencing certain audiences on that side. So I do think distrust in traditional media probably has led to the rise in sort of these more partisan podcasts. I think people also tend to seek affirmation in their own worldviews. Sometimes the traditional media isn't giving you, the perfect. They're not saying exactly what you're thinking. They're giving you information you need, right? And maybe you might disagree with it. People are also looking for smart, funny people to narrate and make sense of kind of this crazy world we live in. And so they turn to podcasters for that stuff too. So we can only do so much. I can't be someone with opinions because I'm not in the opinion side of the Star Tribune. I can't be someone who writes with opinion, but I can be someone who has a well of information and expertise in an area that can be given to people, and maybe it should be in a medium like a podcast at the Star Tribune or however we decide to do it. I think we need to try to meet people where they're at more because they do seek out this form of communication.
Absolutely. I know every day for the most part I wake up, first thing I do, put on the daily from the New York Times. I mean, it's a great way to start your day. When you're taking a shower or whatever, you brush your teeth, you can listen to it, and then, like you said, now you kind of have a news story understood.
Yeah.
And you can go about your day. And also the way you can just do other tasks, whereas when you're reading the news, I mean, you're reading the news, so you can't do that when you're driving or you can't do that when you're making dinner, whereas with podcasting you can. Is the Minnesota Star Tribune thinking about utilizing podcasting at all?
I do know we're talking about it.
Okay.
I think right now they're talking about doing sort of podcasts about specific stories or, kind of how there are like series that come out about, true crime is certainly one of them, but a colleague has one coming out, I think soon. I probably shouldn't reveal too much information about it, but it's going to be a fascinating story. But that's sort of that's all about one story. I do think we're also exploring and should explore some way to give people the news, right? We also have a Curious Minnesota podcast, which is our reader-driven reporting project where people ask questions and our reporters answer it. Like, whatever happened to Camp Snoopy was one that someone did the other day. And they do a podcast where they talk more about the questions that they answered, which is great. And it's a great idea. But maybe we should figure out a way to unpack big news events in the state for an audience in the state, too.
Yeah, like the daily New York Times style, but just for Minnesota or something like that.
And we have so many experts in the room on healthcare, on business, on sports, on variety and arts and entertainment in the city. We should figure out ways to use that and meet people where they're at.
Absolutely. Yeah. Clearly there's an audience for it, too. Yeah. As you see the rise in podcasts over the years. You've mentioned some critiques that you have the journalist industry, but I'm just curious if there's any that come to mind when someone asks you, what's your biggest critique of journalism or the industry you work in?
Yeah, I think we're always like a few steps behind what the audience wants, and I think part of that is that, a lot of people who work in journalism, there's certainly young reporters, but there's a lot of older reporters too. And there was a certain way of doing things for a long time. And I think our industry has hung on to those for a lot longer than maybe we should have, not realizing or either realizing and ignoring the realities of subscriptions, particularly in newspaper legacy media. We are losing print subscribers. And at the same time, we needed to basically be, as if you're looking at a chart, as that was sloping downward, we needed our digital subscriptions to be sloping upward. And the digital subscriptions just aren't keeping pace with the number of print subscriptions we're losing. And print subscriptions are more expensive than digital subscriptions. So we need to get much more subscriptions digitally to make up for even just losing one newspaper subscriber. So I think that we didn't have hard enough conversations about the realities soon enough, and that stifled innovation for a long time. And I'm not just talking about the Minnesota Star Tribune. I'm talking about really newspapers in general. You've seen so many close over the years, which is really sad. Especially there's all sorts of news deserts around the country now where there is no local paper. Minnesota Star Tribune is the state's paper, but in a lot of ways it's trying to fill in gaps where local papers have disappeared. We now have reporters in St. Cloud and reporters in Bemidji and all these different places where there just aren't as many local news outlets as there used to be. So I hope we can figure it out. Yeah. Both because my livelihood depends on it, and because it's important to me, and it's important to a well-functioning society that we have a healthy fourth estate. And it's really imperative on us to get there and figure out a model that sustains it in the future.
Well, I know I certainly hope that that's able to be continued, and I'm sure most of the state does too, especially for the Minnesota Star Tribune. But you talk about the local news agencies or just local newspapers disappearing over the last few years and decades. What's the danger that can come out of that by not having as many local newspapers in America?
Yeah, I mean, we can't be at every city council. We can't be at every, every local government meeting across the state, and so I think just stories are missed, right? I think corruption happens, and no one is there paying attention to it, and also I think stories become. You start to read the same stories over and over again, right? You miss points of view, you miss huge swaths and groups of people if you don't have a presence there. And we can't just drop in, right? I think, places like the New York Times love to drop in to places like Minnesota and do a quick hit story on, some kind of theme popping up our state, or, about Tim Walz or something like that. But if you do that, you also miss a lot of stuff too. You have to be present in a community all the time to build that trust, to get people to tell you what's really going on. So if we don't have people doing that, if there are big, massive news deserts in the country, people are probably being taken advantage of. The systems are going unchecked. People aren't holding truth to power, and that's really devastating to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And then again, it's just you're not allowing the reader to be more knowledgeable. You're depriving the reader of power, basically, by not giving them that knowledge. You've kind of mentioned this, too, with listening to podcasts and it's the way you consume news. But I'm just curious, as a journalist, how do you stay up to date with the news of the day?
Yeah, great question. I increasingly don't use social media to do that. I have an X account, but, even before it became X, even when it was still Twitter, it was such a toxic place that I had to kind of draw it back. As politics has gotten more polarized, places like that really kind of contribute to this burnout that a lot of journalists I know are experiencing. So, I have it. It's a tool in my toolbox. I just don't live on it anymore. I consume news through apps. I have the New York Times and Washington Post app on my phone. I listen to the Daily pretty much every day. I need to listen to the latest episode on Pete Hegseth, a Minnesotan who's going to be in theory, appointed to the Trump administration. I read, I get newsletters. I think increasingly a lot of people are using newsletters to sort of curate the news for them. So I subscribe to political newsletters because I'm interested in politics. And so I will get, a bunch of links in my inbox to very interesting stories, at all these different publications that I respect and choose to read and follow. And I think more and more people do use newsletters as a way to basically say to someone, hey, tell me what are the interesting stories of the day, and then I'll go to them. I use social media, though, too. I do use, like, Instagram. I'm on Instagram, and I follow news organizations on there, and sometimes I'll see their stories that way. So I also look at the Star Tribune, which I think does a good job of this, but and say, hey, we need to be reaching people on social media, too, who are just scrolling through their friends' stories, or they're on TikTok, and maybe this is how they're going to find out that we wrote this story about this. So I think I have a healthy-ish diet with some restrictions for my sanity on, like, X and other platforms that I think are unhealthy. But I think all the time about how I consume news, because I'm like, if I, as a news junkie, if these are the things I rely on, other people are going to want these too. So at the Minnesota Star Tribune, we are rethinking newsletters. We're thinking social media strategies. I hope that helps in getting readers back.
It certainly helps to, just like in like a stocks portfolio. You want to diversify all the things that you're consuming, all the things that you're hearing from day to day. Whether it's in podcasts, sometimes social media, you can find some interesting things from like reporters that are on social media like yourself, but some that are primarily on social media. But also you're gonna have some bad things around there too, so you got to be able to weed that out. But I think I agree with you. The Star Tribune does a good job in putting out information on there, because especially people that are my age, in their early 20s or maybe in their late teens, that are just starting to enter that world of news. They're going to go to what they're familiar with, where it's more often than not. You aren't going to have 16-year-olds that are reading the New York Times, where you're going to have 16-year-olds that are scrolling through TikTok or Instagram. So I think that's a smart way for the Minnesota Star Tribune to kind of curate towards the upcoming audience.
Yeah. I mean, the newer generations just didn't necessarily grow up with a print newspaper in their house, right? That was the norm, and it's not the norm for their generation. So yeah, absolutely, we have to meet people where they're at.
What role do you see AI playing in the future?
That's a great question. It kind of terrifies me. I think in all sorts of creative professions, including writing, AI is a scary thing. I think it can mimic creativity. It can't do it perfectly. But, when budgets are being cut and bottom lines are being considered, does AI replace a reporter? I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
I don't think that's where we're heading. The Minnesota Star Tribune is looking into how AI can actually make our jobs easier without taking away the fundamental role of like a journalist and a writer and a fact checker. There are probably ways in which it can complement what we do and probably there's a lot of things AI can do so quickly that we would probably have spent hours doing, potentially with like mining data or finding things, pulling pieces of information together. So there probably is ways it can help. On the whole, I'm pretty worried about it. I also think it's going to create all sorts of potential misinformation that is going to make us in over our heads trying to fact check and make sure people know what's real and not real. And the line is getting blurred all the time. And AI is just going to increasingly blur that line.
Would it be fair to say you're more pessimistic than optimistic when it comes to AI, at least at this point?
Yeah, I think that's very fair. And I think that's on the creators and the people who are bringing AI into our lives to show us that this is a technology that can be trusted and used responsibly, because social media and advances in technology in the past haven't always been, right? Twitter and Facebook were under heat in the last few presidential elections for being places where misinformation could just spread and grow, and it was going unchecked. And so I worry about AI contributing to that.
Yeah. You and me both. You and me both. Just have about 3 more questions left for you. I know we got other things to do throughout our day, you more than me. But is there a certain story that you look back on in your career so far that you're like, this is something I'm very proud of? Or maybe, I don't know if you would say your crowning achievement because you still have a career that's going on, but something where it's like you look back, you're like, that was me at my best. I was performing at my best. And if so, is there a certain story that comes to mind, or maybe a favorite story of yours that you've written over the years?
That's a great question. I would say the Me Too stuff was a pretty big deal. It was intense and it was nerve-wracking, but I think, and I did a lot of stories, and I feel like at that time in my life, I had a really good editor and a really supportive publication, and I was curious and hungry and really working my hardest. I didn't have a kid yet, and I was not married yet, so I think I just had more time to really like throw myself into this story, and I did work that I was really proud of, and work that is system changing, right? Which is important, right? Sometimes you can feel like you publish a story and you're like, did anyone see this? But there are other stories that people saw, and hopefully changed a system that was not working the way it should for the better. And so I'm very proud of that. I think over the course of my career, I've done a lot of sort of more of this like unseen, maybe underappreciated journalism, which is, explainer journalism. And not just like explainers in the traditional sense of we're like, I'm going to explain to you how this works, but trying to get people trying to demystify state government, trying to make it make more sense to people, and trying to make them more interested in it. And I've done that in various ways. At NPR, we did these videos where I tried to make a cake and explain how budgets were made. Some of it's like pretty silly, but I do think that's an admirable goal, which is to make people care about what their legislature's doing and try to help them understand it. And so I think just trying to demystify politics, and also just being a watchdog, is so important. I think there are so many tedious days at the Capitol where we feel sort of silly staking out the governor's office door or whatever, but that is all watchdog journalism, in the sense that if we weren't sitting there outside of their door, who knows what people might do in positions of power. So, when I stop and think about the totality of almost 15 years at the Capitol, I think I try to remind myself that, the big stories are important, but also sort of everything we do all the time is contributing to this like better society and a well-informed populace and people who hopefully can use that to make good decisions about their lives.
Yeah, it's patriotic. That's how I look at it. I mean, it's very patriotic. What all journalists do, you especially. But this is more of a fun question. I'm curious to hear what you think about this. If you could interview anyone in the world, past or present, who would it be and why?
Wow. I mean, there's so many people. I think because I'm a politics reporter, people would think I'd say like a prominent politician in the past or something. But something else I'm very interested in, one of my second love, is cooking and food. And so I would love to interview Julia Child, who wrote the Art of French Cooking, and she was like this pioneer in the food world. And she was also just this very interesting woman, right? She worked in government and moved to France with her husband at the time, and was bored essentially and took cooking classes with all men and male teachers, and just became this like force in like the culinary world. So I'd love to pick her brain about food, about her philosophy on life. Also, I would love to talk to anyone who lived before the internet about what they think of now. I just what do you think of cell phones and AI? And, I mean, we might as well live on different planets than people who existed completely in a world before any of that stuff was at our fingertips. So in some ways, I'd love to ask her questions about that. There are a lot of people I'd love to interview. But I'm going to say Julia Child. I'm going to stick with that answer.
That's a fair answer. It's fair as any.
Yeah.
I know for me, if someone asked me that, I'd be like, oh my gosh, I could answer 50 people or list 50 people. But I think it would also be interesting to see if you took the founding fathers.
Oh yeah.
And you showed them what is happening in today's politics, and just how the Iraq War happened or Vietnam War happened. I think Thomas Jefferson might faint and just fall over and die if he saw what happened. So
well, the founding fathers are the most quoted and possibly least understood people in history, right? We're always trying to figure out, what did the founding fathers really want? So you could put all those questions to them and see what they say, and realize how all the ways in which the Constitution is probably being misinterpreted in the modern times. So that's a good one too. I mean, here's the thing. Everybody is pretty interesting if you are willing to sit down and ask them questions, right? Some of the best conversations I've ever had is with some Joe Schmo on the street, who just revealed something about the world and politics that you don't necessarily get from talking to the same old talking heads. So anyone, if you really want to sit down and talk to them for a little while, is probably pretty interesting.
I totally agree. Some of the best conversations I've ever had are the Uber drivers that are from Africa. I talked to this one guy when I went to go record a podcast, the Mike McGrath podcast, for those who have listened to it. On the way over, I talked to this guy. He was from Somalia or Ethiopia, at least that area of Africa, and we were just talking about the election and all of that, and he's just so fascinating to hear someone's point of view on that. But that can go for anyone that you just wouldn't otherwise be around. So the diverse viewpoints are fascinating to you and me both, it seems like.
Yeah, absolutely.
My last question here for you. What advice would you give to an aspiring journalist who may be listening?
I would say stick with it. Honestly, it's really daunting to enter into journalism right now. You're told about sort of the financial woes of the industry. You're told that nobody trusts the news media anymore. Why would you want to jump into? You might not be paid very much ever, depending on what medium you go into. It feels like, why would I do this? I think my dad asked those questions when I got into journalism too. This is really going to be something in which you can make a living off of and also be a happy life, but I faced those same questions. I graduated in 2009. The economy was not doing great. News organizations were not doing great. The Star Tribune actually had gone into bankruptcy. So I think, you never really know where things are going to end up. And the Star Tribune is I think, doing well. And I would have a very different life if I didn't pursue journalism. I think stick with it, because you're going to get to every day wake up and talk to someone new, learn something new about the world, about the people in it, and you're never going to be bored, even if it's hard sometimes. So I think, just persevere.
Yeah. Good rule for life.
Yeah.
Well, to a former Husky and a fellow Gopher, it's a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Youthful Perspectives. As always, I hope you're able to learn something new. For me, I was impressed by Briana's emphasis on keeping the reader top of mind when reporting. Whether it's the questions she asks or the stories she pursues, Briana consistently prioritizes the reader over anything else, and I appreciate that. I also appreciate Briana's due diligence in her reporting. From niche local issues to statewide scandals, Briana's professional care for her craft is something I admire. It also demonstrates to us that this level of dedication to our work can transcend multiple fields and be applied to many careers. Finally, Briana's use of the word watchdog is an important reminder to us that good, in-depth, and accurate journalism is fundamental to the health of our democracy and country. By asking tough questions and researching important issues, journalists like Briana ensure that government and its leaders are held in check and reminded that they serve the people like a journalist serves the reader. This is Mason Bierbaum, signing off.